In its infancy, the new Commonwealth of England retained the Rump Parliament, which had both executive and legislative powers, as well as creating the Council of State, which was a smaller group of advisors who had executive privileges and was similar to previous privy councils. Upon the return from his campaign in Scotland in 1651, Oliver Cromwell was disappointed that no functioning government had yet been voted on by Parliament. Cromwell fell into a position of power within the new Commonwealth almost accidentally. Cromwell's grandfather had been one of the wealthiest landowners in and around the town of Huntingdon, but he had many sons, meaning Cromwell's father's inheritance was sizable, yet no longer dominant. In turn, Cromwell's inheritance was even smaller, to the point he was barely considered part of the gentry class. Cromwell had 8 children, but also suffered from depression, something which made it more difficult to maintain his previous wealth. A local dispute in Huntingdon with other gentry ended in him having to sell his properties in Huntingdon and move to the poorer close by town of St. Ives. This struggle and fall from grace awakened a strong sense of spirituality in Cromwell, and he over time became a radical Puritan. He retrospectively analyzed life as a gentry versus life as a normal peasant and didn't like what he saw. When he was a gentry, he and the other gentry were preoccupied with money, power, lust, and any other form of greed imaginable. From that point, he dedicated himself to helping the cause of purifying the government by creating a system for the people rather than the corrupted feudal monarchy that existed up until then. When the Civil War broke out, Cromwell was quick to volunteer, being one of the early military commanders and architects of the new model army, despite a lack of any previous military experience. His continued success on the battlefield earned him praise and elevated him to the level of a patron saint amongst the members of the new model army, and he was a natural choice to be elected to serve on the Council of State. By 1653, Cromwell's disappointment in Parliament turned into disgust when they had still not yet passed a functioning government after 2 years of squabbling. With a few officers from the new model army, Cromwell forced the Rump Parliament to dissolve, and he set out to find a better alternative. Another member of the Council of State, Thomas Harrison, suggested that the next parliament should be based on the ancient Jewish form of government called a Sanhedrin, which was where the members were elected from the churches across the Commonwealth based on their religious credentials. Harrison was part of a radical Puritan sect known as the Fifth Monarchists, who especially paid attention to a prophecy in the New Testament book of Daniel that 4 unsatisfactory monarchies would exist before a fifth and final kingdom of God was established on earth. These radicals began to believe that King Charles's execution had been the end to the fourth monarchy, and that it was only a matter of time before the second coming of Christ would occur. While Oliver Cromwell himself was not a subscriber to the fifth monarchist beliefs, he did like the idea of choosing representatives from church congregations around the Commonwealth, as he hoped that these men would be more religious in nature and thus more willing for compromise and harmony. This small parliament of religious figures became known as the Barebones Parliament, not after the fact that it was smaller than the previous parliaments, but rather that it was named after its leader, Praise God Barebone, who also happened to be the representative for London. The Barebones Parliament was tasked with coming up with a constitution, but as legislation began to be debated, some members realized that a larger than expected portion of the parliament was made up of radical fifth monarchists, who in fact believed the world would be ending quite soon, and their reactionary policies may very well be the end of the Commonwealth. With united support, these concerned members voted to dissolve Parliament. A constitution was drafted and put forward by John Lambert, a distinguished parliamentarian general during the Civil Wars, which named Oliver Cromwell to be Lord Protectorate, aka Dictator for Life. Cromwell was sure to distinguish himself from a king by wearing plain black clothes, while at the same time receiving an annual salary that would have been equal to $21.6 million today in today's money. In 1654, Cromwell was able to negotiate an end to the First Anglo-Dutch War, which was a naval war primarily in the English Channel over the Netherlands' recent rise in global trade prominence after they defeated the Portuguese in a series of worldwide battles in the Dutch-Portuguese War, which began the Dutch colonial empire. The Dutch were innovators and were able to amass a worldwide fleet quickly by inventing the corporation to gather investors together to fund long voyages. They were also a republic at this time, something that the Commonwealth supported tacitly. Cromwell and his allies were mostly concerned with the Orangists, which were a Dutch political faction which believed the powers of the Dutch Republican Parliament should be balanced with that of a monarch from the traditional House of Orange. They believed that the state of the Commonwealth would be in jeopardy if they allowed a king to ascend to the throne in the Netherlands. So part of the peace treaty was that the next king in line, King William III of Orange, would be barred from becoming king in exchange for the English leaving Dutch shipping alone. During this time, the colonies of Newfoundland and New England were flourishing, with the Commonwealth largely staying out of their affairs. The one exception was intervening on behalf of Lord Baltimore's troops and protecting his colony of Maryland from invading Puritan settlers at the Battle of the Severn. The Lord Baltimore came from the Calvert family, which was a respected Catholic family which had worked high up in the administration of King James. King Charles, a proponent of religious tolerance himself, allowed the Calverts to establish the colony of Maryland to be a territory that was religiously tolerant of practicing Catholics. Surprisingly, Cromwell, a Puritan himself, felt some obligation to maintain past promises of the king and to uphold the statutes of their charters. Also, in 1654, Cromwell ordered a massive naval fleet called the Western Design, led by Admiral William Penn, to attack the Spanish position in the West Indies, beginning the Anglo-Spanish War. Cromwell forces failed to take Hispaniola, but did succeed in capturing Jamaica as a possession. Beginning in 1657, Cromwell made a concerted effort to resettle Jews in England after they had earlier been expelled by King Edward during a wave of religious intolerance fervor. Many of these Jews were expelled to Spain, who were then further expelled to the Netherlands, where they obtained commercial jobs indirectly tied to the Spanish gold trade in the New World. Cromwell hoped that by resettling some of these successful Jews from Amsterdam to Netherlands, from Amsterdam to London, he could begin a commercial industry in London. He rationalized this acceptance of the Jews with his strong Puritan beliefs on the idea that the Jews would eventually be converted to Christianity, a step required regardless for the second coming to take place. Also, this year, the Commonwealth entered an alliance with the French, who had been waging their own protracted war against Spain, to take some of their colonial possessions in order to combine their war efforts. The treaty stipulated that England would provide Spain with 6,000 troops and accompanying warships in exchange for the French port city of Dunkirk. In 1658, Oliver Cromwell died from sepsis because of a kidney stone. He was followed by his son Richard, who became Lord Protectorate, but he was forced to resign the following year. The power vacuum allowed General George Monk to march the New Model Army on London and reinstate the Long Parliament. At a loss for how to create a functioning government without a king serving as the head of state, the members of parliament voted to dissolve themselves, ending the Commonwealth government and the New Model Army. That same year, a new parliament was called, known as the Convention Parliament, which voted to restore the monarchy and allow Charles II to return as rightful king. One of his first challenges was to deal with the Dutch trading monopolies, which were seen as unfair to British businesses. Charles II responded by signing the Navigation Acts, which were a series of protectionist laws which made it more expensive to trade with foreign goods. Further, Charles II wanted to take the North American colony of the New Netherlands to help solidify control of the Atlantic coast. In 1665, English ships fired on Dutch ones in the English Channel, prompting the Netherlands to declare war, beginning the Second Anglo-Dutch War. The two sides were again evenly matched, and the conflict was settled in a stalemate. Britain would obtain the colony of New Netherlands in exchange for agreeing to use the Netherlands to trade with all the Holy Roman Empire and to help the Dutch in their effort to promote the freedom of navigation for any commercial vessel, despite the nationality. Unhappy with the stalemate of the previous two conflicts, Charles II secretly allied with France by promising to become Catholic at a later date and declared war on the Dutch in 1672, beginning the Third Anglo-Dutch War. The war was a failure, and Britain withdrew with no real changes in territory or policy. For his part, Charles II tried to pass laws that would relax the practice of Catholicism within Britain, but the bill was rejected by Parliament. In 1679, conspiracy theories about the infiltration of Catholicism began to spread. A fictitious plot known as the Popish Plot was conjured up by a priest named Titus Oates, who claimed to know of a plan to assassinate Charles II and replace him with his presumptive heir, his brother James II, who had recently converted to Catholicism. This paranoia led to the Exclusion Crisis, where Parliament began to move to exclude James II from any future claim to the throne. The crisis led to the creation of the first two major political parties in Britain, the Tories, who supported James II's right to the throne, and the Whigs, who wanted to exclude him by law. Whig extremists began to hatch a plan known as the Rye House Plot, where a group of armed men would hide out in the Rye House mansion, which was located along a planned route that the king was traveling on, and ambush and assassinate him and his brother. After Charles II discovered the plot, many Whig leaders were executed, and efforts to exclude James II were quelled. Charles II died in 1685 and was followed by James II. James II as king tried to push for more religious tolerance for Catholics, but faced fierce opposition. This came to a head when his son was born in 1688, raising the prospects of a Catholic dynasty in England. This caused the Glorious Revolution, whereby James II was deposed and exiled to France. British Protestant elites then chose James II's Protestant daughter, Mary II, to co-reign with her Dutch husband, King William III, who became known as King William of Orange during his reign over the kingdoms, an event that was so feared previously by the now fallen Commonwealth government. Their joint rule is sometimes referred to as the reign of William and Mary. In 1694, Mary II died from smallpox, leaving William of Orange as the sole ruler of England. In 1696, the Jacobites, who were an extremist royalist sect still loyal to King James II, plotted to assassinate William of Orange. The plan failed, but started a crisis on how to ensure William's successor would be a Protestant due to the fact William and Mary did not have any children. The issue was solved by the passing of the Act of Settlement, which banned any future monarch from being Catholic and invited William's Protestant cousins from the German House of Hanover to take the throne following his death. William of Orange died in 1702 and was followed by Queen Anne from the House of Hanover. During Anne's reign, the Acts of Union were signed, which finally formally united Scotland and England into a single kingdom known as Great Britain. Anne died in 1714 and was followed by her cousin George. During George's reign, a massive economic bubble gripped Britain, which burst and caused the widespread financial havoc. The bubble was based around the government-funded corporation, the South Sea Company, which was marketed as a company which was to provide slaves to the Spanish and Portuguese colonies in South America. Britain at this point had been taking advantage of the decline of these empires militarily for quite some time, and thus there was little desire on behalf of the Spanish and Portuguese to trade with them. The South Sea Company, in reality, was set up as a scheme to have the national debt transferred off the government's balance sheet so that they could secure more debt. The company would use the funds from investors to purchase the government debt in exchange for a lucrative bond, which would pay back a higher amount later. Once the investors became aware there was no actual business activities being carried out, the company collapsed and began a national depression. In 1721, an investigation into King George's Privy Council found that almost all members were responsible on some level in participating in the corrupt scheme, with the lone exception being Robert Walpole, who himself was invested in the company and lost his entire life savings. Besides being duped by the South Sea Company fraud, Walpole had developed a reputation of being a savant at the Treasury. He began as a member of Parliament, where he stood out in Whig politics and eventually joined the Privy Council as paymaster of the forces. After the rest of the cabinet was found guilty of fraud and dismissed, only Walpole was left to manage all the posts, something he did quite well, to the point people began to refer to him as the Prime Minister. With the position of Prime Minister established, Walpole exerted a large amount of power to the point it began to eclipse the king. In 1727, George died of a stroke on his way to visit Hanover and was followed by his son, George II. The new powers of Prime Minister and Parliament made George II feel irrelevant, and he spent a large portion of his reign in Hanover, which was easier to have direct control over. He had a poor relation with his son, Frederick, who was the Prince of Wales, and who was personally a supporter of a stronger Parliament at the expense of royal power. Frederick preceded his father in death unexpectedly when he suffered a collapsed lung from the hard impact of a cricket ball during a recreational cricket match. Therefore, when George II died in 1760, he was followed by his grandson, George III. The beginning of George III's reign was marked with the 7 Years' War, which was a world war between England and France over who could become a superpower. The British prevailed and received enormous swaths of territory as their prize, although discontent began to brew in their American colonies. In 1763, the Proclamation Line was established, which banned colonists from settling west of the Appalachian Mountains to preserve the fur trade with the natives. In 1765, the Stamp Act was passed, which levied a tax on most paper documents in the colonies, which the colonists despised. In protest of additional customs duties, colonists dumped perfectly good English tea into the Boston harbor during the event of the Boston Tea Party. In response, the British passed the Intolerable Acts, which introduced military control over the colonies and reduced their freedom of assembly. This angered the colonists so severely that they rose up in revolution and were able to beat the British colonial empire army, known as the Redcoats, in a war of attrition. Following this defeat, George III's mental state rapidly deteriorated as he battled ever worsening symptoms of bipolar disorder. He became known as the Mad King for his mania and unexplainable behavior, where he would talk nonstop for hours and rewrite the same words over and over. Despite his mental illness, he was madly in love with his wife, Queen Charlotte, who took care of him and birthed him 15 children. He also became extremely popular with the public after being open with his mental illness and then consequently showing understanding and forgiveness to 3 separate insane people who all had attempted to kill him. In their defense, he pointed out that none of them had wanted to kill him for political reasons, but rather just to satisfy some delusional task they needed to complete. George III had led Britain to join the various coalition forces against revolutionary France during the Napoleonic Wars. In 1800, he signed the Acts of Union, which unified Great Britain and Ireland into the United Kingdom. In addition to supporting the rights of the mentally disabled, George III was against slavery, and in 1807, he banned the practice of the English slave trade. He died in 1810 from pneumonia and was followed by his son, George IV.